Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about the new COVID-19 booster, the fall booster shot. It's being pushed really hard by this administration, but it is a public health disaster, the likes of which we've never seen before. It's coming to market with literally no clinical data, literally no data at all. And this administration is flirting with the idea of making it recommended or available to anyone over the age of 6 months. This is absolutely crazy talk. I've never seen anything like it. We're going to walk through the evidence, well, lack thereof. We're going to walk through some of the differences between the US and the United Kingdom. We're going to talk about why this is such a failure of FDA drug regulation. So what do you need to know? Well, one, you need to know that back when they were talking about the initial COVID-19 booster, there were two senior officials at the US FDA, Marion Gruber and Phil Krause, and these two officials had worked for decades in the vaccine products portion of the FDA. When they heard that there was going to be a universal booster policy at all ages, irrespective of risk, and irrespective of whether or not you had COVID, they actually resigned. They said the White House was putting too much pressure on them. These are the same two people who never resigned during the Trump administration. So the Biden administration put so much pressure on them, they were forced to resign, whereas Donald Trump didn't. So that's a noteworthy fact. Well, they didn't like the idea of boosters for all. But now we're far past that. We're past boosters for all, bivalent boosters for all, COVID-19 vaccines for children who've already had COVID. These are very bad regulatory decisions. It's hard to believe that the benefit of these products, particularly in people who've had COVID, particularly in younger people, outweigh the risks of the products, which are not zero. Those risks include the risks of the immediate aftermath of injection, where you feel crummy for a day, and also the risk of myocarditis, which is most notable in men between the ages of 12 and 26, but even men between the ages of 8 and 40. I mean, that's a broader range in which there have been some reports and some concern, men more than women, from the mRNA products. Enter the fall COVID-19 shot. This is 2023. We're not in 2020 anymore. The risk of the virus itself has fallen precipitously. The majority of Americans have had and cleared COVID-19. Almost all children have had COVID-19. So the benefit of this vaccine, the upper bound benefit, is going to be small at best, even if there is a benefit. We'll never know. They're never running clinical studies. And the harms are not fully characterized. Every time you take the sequence of the virus and you alter it in the vaccine product, you might get less myocarditis, but you might get more. You don't know what you're going to get. And if you might get more myocarditis, you might really have a problem on your hands. So this administration has already painted the canvas, so to speak. They've already put out announcements in the press suggesting that they're going to pursue a booster strategy for everybody. That's different than our peer nations. The United Kingdom, whose vaccine advisory group are not complete and total buffoons, they have actually recommended the vaccine fall booster predominantly for people over the age of 65. I actually quibble with that as well, because even there they won't have data, but it's certainly better than the United States policy, which is to pursue this doggedly in 20-year-old college students who've had COVID 3 times? What are we even doing in the United States? At least the UK is more sensible than that. The next piece of evidence, as we move into the fall COVID-19 booster program, the US FDA, they're quick to give the EUAs, the emergency use authorizations, out, but they're not quick to enforce the post-marketing commitments. They're not actually making Pfizer produce the data that was compelled years ago. In fact, Pfizer has a commitment to measure troponin levels in young men who have been administered this vaccine to look for subclinical myocarditis. We have a couple of small-scale investigations from Thailand and Switzerland that puts this at 3% of men in this age group. But we need the post-marketing commitment of the U.S., which is the Pfizer study. The FDA has repeatedly pushed back the requirement to turn in these data. Waleed Jalad writes on Twitter, in the FDA's own words, the existing safety surveillance systems would be insufficient to pick up this potential serious issue, referring to subclinical myocarditis. He writes, quote, how could CDC possibly recommend everyone get another booster, even young healthy people with prior infection, without these data? This is August 31st on Twitter. So Waleed Jalad is an expert in drug safety from the University of Pittsburgh, professor of medicine there. He's concerned by this as well. I'm concerned by it as well. Now, let's talk about the need for randomized controlled trials. You see, the problem with any other way to assess the efficacy of the booster is it's going to be confounded. The people who choose to get the booster are different than the people who don't choose to get the booster, and that becomes more and more true with each passing month. The kind of person who rushes out to the doctor to get the latest booster is not the typical person. In fact, they're a minority of people. The last one, I think, had 14% uptake. This, I expect, will have 7% uptake or less than that. It's going to be somebody who's otherwise extremely precautious, takes other other sort of mitigation in their life, and also they may have a different health profile entirely. Now, we showed in the New England Journal of Medicine in a correspondence that a prior analysis that came out of Israel that looked at observational study comparing people who got boosted and those who didn't get boosted, and I talked about this in a prior video on this channel, was hopelessly confounded because not only was there a difference in COVID-related death, there was a massive difference in death from any reason. But you can't believe that the COVID-19 vaccine can lower your risk of death for any reason by 90%. It's not literally the fountain of youth water, okay? It's not that. So why would you see that difference in a non-COVID endpoint for a COVID vaccine? And the answer can only be that very different people are taking it. And that's what we argued in the journal. And the authors of that Israeli analysis basically conceded all the points to us. This is entitled Potential Healthy Vaccinee Bias in a Study of BNT162b2 Vaccine Against COVID-19. That's the Pfizer-BioNTech. Now, in the absence of credible data, I see a number of people in the Biden administration, including the deputy of the CDC, saying crazy things like, well, if we vaccinate kids, it might mean you're less likely to spread this to grandma this winter. That's absolute bullshit, frankly. He has no evidence ever that conducted this entire pandemic that a vaccination program in children slows the spread of the virus in older and more vulnerable age groups. He has no evidence of that at all. We could have studied that in a randomized fashion, by randomly selecting people in a randomized control trial of vaccines and swabbing their close contacts to measure spread in those households. We never did that. Pfizer has 100 billion reasons they can run all of these studies. They can tell us myocarditis. They can tell us whether or not vaccines work in healthy young men who've had COVID. They can run multiple randomized control trials. They have $100 billion. The only thing you need to get them to run this study is an FDA that's not what it seems to be working directly for the best interests of Pfizer. An impartial FDA would be able to compel the manufacturer to generate these data. The FDA is falling on their face. They're just failing at this. I don't know what to say. I have never before witnessed as great a failure of the FDA as I have during the COVID-19 vaccine programs, and I've written about it extensively. More to come on that. Now, in contrast with the Biden administration, perhaps even in contrast with the United Kingdom, what would I recommend if I were in charge of things? In my Substack post, I actually talk about this. I say, number one, the Biden administration is not science-based. They're not. Actually, in some ways, it's ironic that they're as ignorant as the fringe anti-science elements that they condemn. They're going on the internet to shoot down any misinformation, but they themselves are the greatest promoter of misinformation. You've got Rochelle Walensky saying, we know for sure people who've been vaccinated don't spread. You have Anthony Fauci saying cloth masks work. They are the biggest promoter of misinformation, and yet they want to silence fringe misinformation. To me, the worst kind of misinformation is government-sanctioned misinformation. Number two, my second point in my post was that I personally will never receive another COVID-19 vaccine until someone shows to me that somebody of my age, with my health, which I think is good, who's already had COVID, by the way, I have, benefits from this vaccine. Now, you need to do a randomized trial with the power to prove that someone like me will benefit. Practically, given that this is an anti-science administration not running any randomized trials, this evidence is never going to be generated, and as such, I'm not going to take the vaccine. I also highly doubt that there would be a benefit in someone like me, even the power calculation to show a benefit to someone of my age and health who's had all these doses in the past, and I've had 3 doses, 2, compelled by my employer, and then I've also had COVID. To show that there's a benefit to me, we're probably talking about sample sizes of like 10 million people per arm. And once you get to a sample size like that, you've got to ask yourself, what the hell are you even doing? It's pointless. The third point is I would not advise anyone under the age of 65 who is healthy to get this vaccine, and that's in line with the United Kingdom's advice. Number 4, I would not advise anyone who's had COVID to get this vaccine. I can't imagine there could be much benefit if you've already had and recovered from COVID-19. For those who are over 65 with medical problems and no prior COVID-19, who, find me this unicorn, over 65, medical problems, no prior COVID-19 that they know of, one, I would check for antibodies for COVID-19. You probably already had it, you don't even know. But if you're antibody negative as well for COVID-19, then what I'd say is, let's hear what the person says. I would imagine that 90+% of people in this demographic are going to say, I'm not that interested. And as a doctor, what evidence would you have to push them? You have no evidence. So if they say they're not interested, they're not interested. And I think I can't be any more interested than they are. I would discourage all COVID-19 vaccine in anyone under 30 at this point. I think that's absolutely crazy. I think most other European nations have literally stopped those programs. Colleges and hospitals should never mandate this booster. If they want to have a diminishing workforce, then sure. But if they want to actually run their operations correctly and be ethical, they should never mandate this booster. It would be absolutely unethical to mandate this booster because it has no benefit to third parties. You can't even pretend that it does. You've never measured that. And it's implausible that it would because no prior booster ever has been able to curtail the spread of the virus. So I continue to oppose the universal booster program. It is anti-science. It's pro-Pfizer revenue. It's an absolute failure. I mean, what it will do for trust in public health and vaccination campaigns is absolutely horrific. It's going to liquidate trust. This administration is being run by a handful of the most zealous and non-evidence-based people imaginable. They've literally gone to universities and said, give me your worst scientists to advise us, and that's how they're doing things. Anybody who studies evidence-based medicine would know they're making mistake after mistake, and this is not how you would run a program. The last thing I'd say is, what about slowing spread? Is that an important endpoint? I mean, what am I to think? All of the studies on the COVID-19 vaccines show a very short-lived effect on symptomatic SARS-CoV-2 or even asymptomatic SARS-CoV-2. We don't really have a perfect study to study spread in a randomized fashion, but we do know it barely puts a dent in asymptomatic or symptomatic SARS-CoV-2 and it dissipates with 2 months. I mean, the idea that this would slow spread in a population is like if the forest fire is raging down the hill towards your house, and before you evacuate, you take a bottle of water and you pour it out on your lawn. That's really what you're doing here. You're not going to slow the forest fire. And it would be absurd to think you would. And yet that's what this administration and the deputy CDC director would have you believe. Absolutely crazy talk. Now let's compare it to the flu vaccine. This is where I think things get interesting. Now, somebody asked me, look, you're very critical of this, and I kind of see your points that this should probably have better evidence before we launch this campaign. Isn't the flu vaccine the same thing? We debut a flu vaccine. We debut a yearly flu vaccine year after year without randomized data. And I'd say, sure, yes and no. Let's talk about it, okay? So how are ways they are different? So the number one way the flu vaccine and COVID vaccine are different is that the COVID shot is way more immunogenic. I mean, did you ever know people who got the flu shot and then many people take a day off work because they have rigors in bed? No. The COVID-19 vaccine is far more immunogenic. We all know that. It has more arm pain, it has more swelling, it has more fever, it has more people taking a day off work. That's easy to say. There's a difference. So the more you actually lower life days, I mean, you're lowering productive work days just by giving the vaccine, you need to have evidence that you have a commensurate benefit on the back end to justify that harm you've paid up front. It might be a minor harm to many people, just missing a day of work, but it's not a negligible harm when you factor in the fact we're giving this to hundreds of millions of people. A wise man told me that in our entire medical career, there is no decision that's going to affect as many people that's made with as little data to counsel a person on as this decision. Number two, COVID shots have a far steeper age gradient than flu. I mean, COVID has a huge age risk gradient. We know old people are very vulnerable. We know young people are 1,000 or 10,000 times less vulnerable to the virus than older people. You factor in prior immunity, you factor in doses. I mean, this is a mess. The absolute risk to the lowest age groups is so negligible in a way that it's not for flu. I mean, you could argue it's much higher for flu. That's another difference. But the truth is, we have no idea what the absolute risk is to a 55-year-old who had 2 doses and has had COVID before going into this fall season. There's new strains circulating. We don't know what their risks are of being hospitalized or actually sick with COVID-19. We have no clue. So we don't even know what we're trying to lower. 3, annual COVID-19 shots have a serious safety concern. That concern is myocarditis, and the FDA has not made the manufacturer do the required studies. They have continued to delay this post-marketing commitment. That is an abject regulatory failure. You've had the 2 senior-most officials in vaccine products resign over the idea of boosting repeatedly young people, okay? This is a crisis, a regulatory crisis that everyone is silent on. Why? Because most academics are nakedly partisan Democrats and they don't want to criticize a Democratic administration. If Trump were in office and he made the exact same decisions, the exact same people who tell you should get your fall booster would say, absolutely not. Trump has no data. We shouldn't do medicine without data. They have no principled stance. They've never had a principled stance and never will because they're not actually students of evidence. They think too much with their political hat. I don't, actually, because, as I say, I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter. But still, I have some sense when it comes to medicine. Medicine is an apolitical game. 4, the post-marketing commitment. 5, they resigned. Okay, I already went through the points. Now let's say how they're similar. How they're similar is that the flu shot actually would benefit from a lot more randomization. You can do challenge trials. That's a randomized controlled trial. You can do randomized controlled trials at deployment. And we need to acknowledge that the flu shot actually has a weaker evidence base than many people acknowledge. Let me read you some quotes. This is from Cochrane. By the way, Jefferson is also a reviewer on these Cochrane flu reports. from 2018 Cochrane for healthy adults. Quote, inactivated vaccines can reduce the proportion of healthy adults, including pregnant women, who have influenza and influenza-like illness, which is called ILI, but their impact is modest. We are uncertain about the effects of inactivated vaccines on working days lost or serious complications of influenza during influenza seasons. We're uncertain. Why? Because there's not enough randomized data. From the 2018 update on kids, quote, in kids between the ages of 3 and 16, live influenza vaccines probably reduce influenza, moderate certainty, and may reduce ILI, low certainty evidence. So there's low certainty about the syndrome we really care about, which is not influenza per se, but influenza-like illness, which is being sick with something that feels like flu. Really doesn't matter whether or not the PCR says it's flu or not. Do we lower the entity that literally matters in the life of people? And that has low certainty evidence. For both vaccine types, the absolute risk reduction in influenza and ILI varies considerably based on the study population, making it difficult to predict how these findings translate to different settings. And quote, we found very few randomized control trials in children under 2 years of age, end quote. What are we to do when people are talking about boosting 6-month-olds? There's no credible data, okay? We are far beyond the edge of randomization for the elderly. Quote, older adults receiving influenza vaccine may have a lower risk of influenza from 6 to 2.4%, and probably a lower risk of ILI with those who do not receive a vaccine over the course of a single influenza season. Quote, we are uncertain how big a difference these vaccines will make across different seasons. Very few deaths occurred and no data on hospitalization were reported, end quote. In other words, we actually need to elevate the flu vaccine to modern regulatory standards. We need far more randomized control trials. We need randomized control trials of rollout. We need randomized control trials that are challenge trials. We need randomized trials for college students. We need randomized trials of different healthcare incentive structures, actually measuring hard endpoints like days from work lost or ILI. We need important series of randomized trials, a randomized trials agenda. Who could have actually done such a thing? I don't know. Maybe if you were the head of, the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease. Oh, that's Anthony Fauci. And guess what? He did absolutely nothing. He likes to go on television and give people his opinion and talk like he knows things. He's unable to say those 3 magic words, I don't know, and he's unable to actually do any randomized controlled trials. And in my mind, that's why he failed as a scientist. And I have a special post on my Substack talking about that, which subscribers could be able to take a read. In the absence of randomized trials with a flu shot, we actually use something called a test negative case control, where you take people who come in with an influenza-like illness and you compare the ones who tested positive to those who tested negative for the prior antecedent receipt of the flu shot, and it's sort of a case control study, so it gives you an odds ratio, not a relative risk, and all these kinds of things. This is a flawed method, okay? It's not a bias-free method. It's not a randomized method. Anyone who says that it approximates randomized trials needs to show me an analysis where we have taken a battery of test negative case controls and compared them to corresponding randomized trials and have a correlation coefficient from that, because I can't find such a study. Unlike other observational methodologies such as RCT duplicate, where we do have a comparison of these two methods in JAMA, for instance, the Sebastian and Schniedelweiss paper, we don't have it for this kind of structure. And I suspect it hugely is upwardly inflated for lots of reasons that I won't get into on this video. But even with that upward inflation, we're talking about vaccine effectiveness per the CDC's own studies of 10%, 21%, 52%, 37%, 41%. This is what they're quoting from their own biased methodology. These numbers are low. They're very low. And they actually suggest that even if you're a proponent of flu vaccines, why wouldn't you want to randomize people to 6 different vaccines? Maybe the 7th arm should be no vaccine at all, and pick the winner. The one that's winning, you'll give that to more people. Why do you want to commit everything to one vaccine and accept a 10% post hoc test negative case control effectiveness? Why do you want to accept something so low? Why don't you want to have a bunch of candidate compounds? Why do you really think you can't introduce randomization here? So putting this all together, there's a brilliant essay by Peter Doshi, which I attach in my Substack. You should read it. It's called Influenza, Marketing Vaccine by Marketing Disease. So it's talking about how they market the vaccine by marketing the disease, and they have very low levels of evidence. This is from the BMJ from about a decade ago. Back to the COVID-19 vaccine. I think this is a total disaster. I mean, we talk about Aduhelm, how that is a failure of the FDA. We talk about the cancer drugs that the FDA is approving based on uncontrolled studies of 40 people. This is a campaign to vaccinate hundreds of millions of Americans based on 0 clinical trial data, a guess about what COVID-19 strains will be relevant, no idea if it actually benefits anyone who's ever gotten COVID before, which is most people. We're literally vaccinating it for something you've had before and had multiple doses. It's crazy. It's just really, really crazy. It's hard to wrap your head around why they're doing this unless the goal is merely to commit to prior blunders, which it probably is, and enrich Pfizer. Because if Pfizer doesn't get this, they're not going to get the revenue they want. Already, people are crying in Pfizer and Moderna that they're not getting the revenue that they are used to, that $100 billion. It's okay to give a company $100 billion. I'm a capitalist. I believe that you can give a company $100 billion, but they got to earn $100 billion. You got to prove to me your products are benefiting Americans. And they have barely done that, in the initial randomized control trial. But they haven't done that for young people, for college students, for people who've had COVID. They haven't done that for booster after booster after booster. The thing about medicine is most medical products have a big benefit when used in very critically ill populations, but they have diminishing returns to the point at which they actually have net harm when you expand those populations, when you have indication drift, when you give dose after dose after dose. That's almost surely what's going on here. We have no idea because we don't have any randomized studies. So the people in this administration, Bob Califf and Marks and Jha until recently, and Vivek Murthy, these are not the wisest people to be making these decisions. These are people who have proven that they care more about politics than medicine. I mean, let's just take Ashish. Ashish Jha is literally the Biden COVID coordinator because Biden saw him on CNN and liked him on cable news. That's what a bunch of news outlets report. Why did Biden like him on cable news? Because he was tweeting a lot. So you literally have a system where somebody who tweets bullshit in support of the administration will get pulled on cable TV because they're preaching to the choir, and then cable TV will amplify them in the eyes of politicians, and the more they kiss up to the politicians, the more likely they are to work for the politicians. This is the worst possible system. Waleed Jalad is the best person for the job. Sometimes he praises the administration, sometimes he doesn't. Okay, he's very good. I can think of a dozen people in evidence-based medicine who would be far better than these people. Randomized trials, of course, they're absolutely needed for COVID-19 shots. Who are you kidding? And of course, the UK is better than the US by not vaccinating people under the age of 65. That's much more logical. The US is crazy town. Of course, they're also needed in flu shots. And of course, we need to do more there. Of course, we need information, causally valid information through randomization. And we cannot live with low levels of evidence that are merely passed down to us through historical accident. So, I don't know what to say. I think I've hit most of the high points. Oh, let me read you one last thing. This is by Scott Balasidis, who is a doctor who works in the pharmaceutical industry. Let me read you what he says, quote, on Twitter. Quote, "First, do no harm. A medical intervention should be recommended only with clear evidence that benefit outweighs possible harm. There is no high-quality evidence that boosting a COVID-immune child produces benefit, so even a very low risk of harm is reason not to recommend. The CDC hypothesizes potential benefit from further boosting in kids, but currently lacks supporting evidence. Per the scientific method, the hypothesis should be tested in a company-funded randomized trial. If the benefit is shown, great, then recommend. I say this as a professional researcher in antiviral drug and vaccine development. I would never want my interventions used without evidence because I want to be sure that I'm helping rather than hurting. We shouldn't deviate from that standard." It's so simple. This is the principle for everything for 30 years of evidence-based medicine. It's being derailed for this issue. They're taking advantage of the fact that there are, in fact, yes, fringe people who say crazy things about vaccines that we cannot agree with. But those fringe people do not mean you're justified in enrolling booster after booster in hundreds of millions of people without credible data. You're enriching a company. You're not generating evidence for the American people. You're committing perhaps the greatest medical blunder of the last quarter century. The repercussions of this are going to be so massive. Trust in public health is already rock bottom. It's going to get lower. One of these days, you're going to get a safety signal you didn't anticipate when you keep tinkering with the sequence. It could be more myocarditis. It could be something else. You're going to get somebody to do analysis that's going to blow up in your face. It could be increased cardiovascular mortality among young men. It's going to be something that sticks to you, and you're going to look like a damn fool. And when the history books are written 50 years from now, every single one of these people, Jha, Murthy, Fauci, Califf, are going to be listed under they didn't practice good science, they were political hacks, and they failed the American people. Promise you that's how it's going to go down, okay? If you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. Send it to anyone who's thinking about the vaccine. I think it's the most balanced view. I think the uptake is going to be 7%, and it's going to be a very unusual 7% of people. I think we can guess who they're going to be. I'm not taking it. I don't know anyone who's going to take it. Every one of my friends who are doctors aren't going to take it. No one's going to take it. I think most people don't want it. No one's going to let anyone go near their kids with this booster. I'm pretty sure that's how it's going to go down. Like this video, like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. Send it to a friend, and I'll be back with more videos.